Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started in our presentation today through the Center for Transformative Nursing and Health Research. My name is Dr. Marcia Campbell-Yo. I'm the acting director for the center. And just before I introduce our guest today, I just want to acknowledge that we are joining you today. And for the people who are present in the room, in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, we are certainly all treaty people. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce to you today our speaker who has traveled from Sweden to speak with us today. And it's Dr. Åsa Audulv, and she is a nurse and associate professor at the Umeå University, which is in Sweden, as I mentioned. And her talk today and her focus of her research primarily focuses on self-management among people with complex long-term conditions. And she is particularly interested in one of her primary strengths is around research methodology, and particularly in how longitudinal qualitative research with respect to recurrent data collection with the same participants, and how this is performed and how it can be developed within health research. So also, fun fact, as I've had a chance to speak with Åsa today, and she actually has had a long-standing relationship with the School of Nursing and the Faculty of Health. She was a postdoc here, and she's going to probably tell us a little bit more, with Dr. Tanya Packer, who is in the School of Occupational Therapy, and they continue to have a very strong collaboration and are currently here doing some work. I should say, not just some work, it sounds like they're doing very intensive analysis, and Åsa actually brought her PhD student with her as well. So again, without further ado, please join me in welcoming you, Åsa. Look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. So I'm very happy to be here, and coming to Halifax and Dal is a little for me also kind of coming home, because I lived with my family in Halifax for 6 months. It feels like longer, but it was in 2012 when I was a postdoc here, and since then I'm come and visited once or twice a year, except for the last 2 years. But also during the pandemic, we have kept up a quite close collaboration, having meeting every other week. And sometimes those meetings are very well scheduled in like the Swedish afternoon and the Halifax morning. Sometimes they are scheduled very much in the Halifax afternoon and the Swedish evening. I've spent a lot of Friday afternoon, like Friday evenings with Tanya. And now when I'm working from here, I have still had like negotiated my Swedish meetings and my Halifax meetings, meaning that I sometimes start working in 4 in the morning. But that what happens when I guess you are more used to kind of working across time zones that we are in Sweden. So in Sweden, I'm actually living in Sundsvall, which kind of in the middle of Sweden, and my university is here up in Umeå, quite in the north of Sweden, and down here you have Stockholm, where there's currently a lot of snow coming. They had like 30 centimeters just a few days ago, and the traffic was really bad. Today I'm going to talk about qualitative longitudinal research, and particularly about how the time element, how time and change can be analyzed and brought into these kind of studies. And I also, in this project that we're working with, do have several co-authors, so I'm not alone in doing this. My way into QLR, I would qualitative longitudinal research, began during my PhD, where I collected a data material of people that had recently been diagnosed with a long-term condition. And I interviewed them the first time when they were newly diagnosed, then 6 months later, then 1 year after they were diagnosed, and then after 2.5 years. So with the same participants, we collected this data material at 4 different time points. That meaning that I ended up with about 18 interviews. And I didn't really have a good plan for how to analyze that kind of data. And the problem with QLR is that there haven't been much written about the analysis. There are, and especially this was done in 2009 and 10. So at that time there were one book, Saldana's book, about qualitative longitudinal data and work, but there have been published a lot since then. So we kind of struggled some with how to really analyze this complex and large data material to actually kind of look at what happened with these people over time and how did their self-management change over these 2.5 years that interviewed them. And it resulted in 2 publications. After I finished with those publications, I was still kind of intrigued but the analysis part, like how did we do this and how could it be done in a better way? And I began to work with another Åsa Knäck, and she had also collected a longitudinal data material with people that had been newly diagnosed with diabetes and over the first year of having diabetes. So we kind of sat down and looked at how I had been doing my analysis and how she had been doing her analysis, and we kind of then can describe this is a way of doing analysis to really look at things that change over time. And also when looking at our analyses, we also started reading other papers to see how do they describe the analysis? How do they present the results? What are they actually focusing on when presenting these results? So that was kind of my first coming into this field. And then a couple of years went by and I was starting to work with another group. And I again kind of thought, well, you know, we really had some ideas there when we read all Louis' articles. I would like to do something more with a more systematic and with more structured thing about that. So we started to do a method study to actually look more systematically how is that qualitative longitudinal research used in health research, and that was published a few months ago. But we are actually kind of dividing that study into pieces. So the first study has now been published. The second that I'm also going to present for you, I hope that I will be able to submit it before Christmas, but you know how you are with plans.
Yeah.
So the aim of this first kind of a method study was that we wanted to map how the QLR articles within health science literature capture aspects of time and change. How did they collect data over time? What kind of data did they collect over time? Were they particular kind? Could you kind of divide those studies into certain types of studies? So that was kind of what we wanted to go out and see. So then we did quite a large systematic search and ended up with almost 3,000 abstracts. And we went down, so we at the end had 299 articles that were kind of representing this field from 2017, 18, and part of 19. So, and our inclusion criteria were really broad. We wanted health science research, and we wanted that they should have a longitudinal data collection. So they should have collected data with the same participants over time or at the same location over time. And we excluded protocols, other kind of method pieces, review articles. But before I get into what we actually found in those, I would talk a little more about what QLR is. So when we go to the method literature, and there are some really good articles about QLR today. They are not really absolutely consistent in how QLR is defined, but they're quite consistent. And what the first criteria is that the data should be collected over time in a recurrent way with either the same participants that are interviewed or observed at several time points, or you might collect diaries or anything at several time points. But in some also that you can collect data at maybe the same organization several. You go to the same hospital ward and collect data in the fall and in the winter and in this next summer and look at that. But it's not just collecting data over time, it's also focusing, aiming to describe or understand or explore something with time and change. So the focus of the study should also kind of be to try to understand what is happening over time. And in health research, temporality is really important. We have a lot of concepts and areas that are happening over time. We have patients that are getting ill, that learn to live with a diagnosis, that are learning self-management, that are in recovery, that are transferred between wards. A lot of things happening over time. And by looking at how it happens over time, we can actually get to understand what happens to patients in another way than just looking at isolated samples. But time is also kind of a difficult concept because there are different ways of understanding and conceptualizing time. And one very used way of conceptualizing time is to talk and look at time as chronological. That we do when we look at our watch and say that now the time is 2:10. And we will say I will talk for an hour. And because if in a chronological time, an hour is always an hour. And we can like measure like in this, and when looking at we can measure this distance, it's as long as this distance, this is an hour, and that's an hour, and this is an hour. And when we talk about overtime, we often focus on the time point. This is a time point, and then it's an hour, and then we have a new time point, and then it's an hour, and we have a new time point. Well, we can also understand time from a more subjective and fluid perspective, where we would say that some hours are more important than other hours. Maybe you have experienced an hour that actually were life-changing. Maybe some hours in your life you will remember forever, and maybe some days will just go back, pass by. So looking at it from a fluid perspective, we would say that some times are more important than other times, and some times are actually moving faster than other times. This hour might feel like forever. So if we again look at time as water, which is often kind of described in the literature, would say that some hours the water is really, really still and nothing really happens. And it's some time points that time is rushing, like in a flood. And the distances then isn't like as consistent as we usually tend to think in chronological time. And we are also talking about a through time perspective, where we try to understand not only the red dots, but the time that happens in between the red dots. And both these perspectives are used in QLR literature. So in this method study, we had those 299 studies, and that is a lot, I realized, after some time. They were published in 193 different journals, and they represented 41 different countries. So we can see that QLR is widespread. It's published little here and there. It's not like there's one journal that's like focusing on this. A lot of them were about patients, 45%, but 20% of these articles used combined populations like patients and family members, patients and healthcare providers, which is actually kind of giving the intention that a lot of these are really complex studies. 52 of them were part of a larger project, like they were described and published in several research articles. So they are really large and they are really complex. When we look at their aims, they can kind of express this longitudinality in different ways. Some had a clear focus on changes through time, and they were using words like process, trajectory, transition. They could be looking at patterns of change. They could like investigate the maintenance, the stability, the shifts, or something. They could look at those phenomena that by themselves are changing, like learning or implementation, because in learning or implementation, there is built in the concept that things are happening when we are talking about learning. We can also have focus on the data collection period and say, well, we investigate the experiences of this kind of patient over 6 months, or over a specific period, like during pregnancy, or for people moving into a nursing. And they had little differences in how they were kind of expressing those longitudinal in their aims. So some of them, they really had time or change as a phenomenon of interest. They aimed to understand changes in identity. How do identity change? And then in that kind of study, the change is actually the focus of the study. But other studies, they more looked at time and change as the outcome of the study. They were more exploring factors that contribute to maintenance or something like that. Then they were more of looking at change as the outcome. What is making this change happen? If we are looking at this magnolia bud, we would say that the first one is actually a study describing how do this bud unfold into a flower. While the second would be more on what are the factors that making the magnolia bud flower? Does it flower faster if it's sun? Would the rain impact on how it unfolds? And then there were also those studies that actually didn't put much emphasis on time and change, but more as the context. So they would like have, well, describe experiences of breastfeeding up to 3 months postpartum. We would kind of look at it during this time period, but the time period in itself wasn't in focus. And that would be like looking at the magnolia bud, because we get a lot of variation if you watch that magnolia bud over a few situations over the next couple of days. But it's not the actual changing process. It's good to collect over time, because then we get a varied sample, a lot of situations, deep narratives. So when we try to look at this, we were kind of wondering how much QLR are the different QLR articles that we have collected. And we had a very broad inclusion criteria. We wanted to collect every study that had a longitudinal data collection. That was, as you know, the inclusion criteria. So all the studies have a longitudinal data collection. But when we then looked at, do they call themselves longitudinal? Then you had 247. So, well, a good portion said this longitudinal study is, and they also said that in the title. And sometimes they said that in the title and they said it nowhere else in the whole article. And then we looked at how many self-identified as a longitudinal qualitative study. And they were only 5 that actually said, in this qualitative longitudinal study, we did. And this was also often stated in the abstract or in the title. And we looked about the aims and we saw like, okay, actually 231, they do have some longitudinal term in their aims, but they could have longitudinal, it could be seen as the center, as kind of the outcomes or the context. It could also be over 3 months or during pregnancy. And when we kind of looked at how many of them are actually looking on change, you know, the kind of definition for a longitudinal study was that it collected data over time, but also that it focused on change. It was only 71. So now we are a lot, but small proportion that actually had an aim that focused on investigating something that changed. And when we looked at the method references, only 20% of the articles that we looked at were using method references that described QLR. And there are method references for QLR, but I guess that many of these, and here too, it was a very broad sample with a lot of different journals, different authors, and many of these authors might not have been writing this kind of paper before. So they might not have been into that there are literature on this, even though it wouldn't have been hard to actually search for. Median of participants were 20, and about half used individual interviews. But a lot of them combined different kind of qualitative material. And this goes again, like when I said before, that they use different populations, both patients and family members. They use both interviews and observations, or interviews and documents. And many of them also kind of collected both qualitative and quantitative data. So they were very complex studies in total, and quite large studies. The median was 46 interviews, which is kind of a large qualitative study, even though they ranged from 3 to 507. So very wide range. Looking at how long data collections they had, most are done within a year. There are quite many of them that are like 7 to 12 months. There are a few that are up to 25 years, so actually 2. And a few that are 10 years or so, but a lot of them are if looking at the QLR literature, relatively short, because these are up to 3 months. Even though I can also see that there are a lot of processes within healthcare that happens within 3 months. So it makes sense for looking at trajectories within severe complications, or people going to ER, or older people moving into nursing homes, and kind of following up in that time frame. So definitely there are good studies that can be done even with shorter qualitative. It might also kind of mirror the pragmatic lens of research, that it is difficult to really get money and resources for really long studies. Then we kind of started to looking more into the data collection. what kind of data, how are they really collecting this longitudinal data? And at the beginning, we kind of had the idea that it would be some kind of model studies that could kind of, well, maybe there are 4 different types of how they are collecting data, but it wasn't. So we kind of came up with, there are 3 different components that you need to make decisions about when kind of designing a longitudinal data collection. And the first one is, what should be followed over time? Should we follow individuals, organizations, families? What would be like the units that we follow over time? The second would be, what is the tempo of the data collection? Should it be very intense, a lot of interviews on a short while? Should it be spread out with 1 interview every 6 months or every year? Or should we do maybe observations over 2 months and come back 6 months later and do other intense observations for 2 months? And should the third one was about, should we collect the data in the same mode for everyone? Should we pre-plan and say we will collect data at 1, 6, and 12 months, or should we actually let the participants' needs and experience kind of steer in what way and when we are collecting data? And should we collect data in the same mode for all participants or in different ways for different participants? I will go a little more into these. The first one, entities over time. It's quite easy to grasp that kind of concept because we always need to kind of decide for our studies, what are we kind of focusing on? Are we focusing on individuals or settings or groups? But then if we are focusing on, for instance, settings, we don't really need to collect data from the same individuals every time. We can go to this hospital ward and make observations once a year to see what happens, or how is different things integrated, how are they working with different procedures. The tempo is a little more interesting. One that was the tempo that was most prevalent is kind of using serial time points, interviewing people in kind of a short engagement at 3 or 4 time points. But other things that should be also considered as possibilities are more time waits, where we do observations, or more intense interviewing over some period of time, then leave the field and then go back to the field after some time, or the continuous, where the researcher collected meeting minutes from all the meetings from some steering committee, and then, or when they collected diaries or other things, they kind of made more continuous data collection of a certain type of data material. And what I found was really interesting was the way the researcher were pre-planning or adapting the data collection. And that could also be done in different ways. It could be very pre-planned, and you say, yeah, we are collecting data at these time points, like I did in my first QLR study during my PhD, and most did, 74%. But there were also some that were more theoretical and analysis driven, and kind of trying to get to like, what do we need to get further into this analysis? We might want to collect data from certain people again, or from other kind of people at this setting again. And then we had those that actually adapted the data collection to the different participants. So for participant A, a lot of things happened during this time period. So then they did more interviews with you. But for participant C, there weren't so much going on in her life. So they had not so many data collections with patient C. So they kind of, it differed depending on what was relevant for the different participants. And then we also had some studies that used more of it, actually let the participants enter the data. So it was up to the participants to enter diary extracts or more of that kind of data or open-ended survey questions in Umeå, how much they felt that they wanted to do that. But it should also be, because if we want to do more of a fluid time perspective, it actually makes more sense that we can get more data from some participants that they have a more intensive time and that we want to be there and collect data when things are happening. And it might not happen in the same mode or in the same tempo for all our participants. But I will actually see if you have any questions now, because I'm just talking. And then we can go into the second part of the other articles then, because this is basically the first method.
Yeah, I've been working on a project with a group of individuals, and definitely the interviews have been at 6-month intervals, which of course got thrown off in the context of the pandemic. But we were looking, it was really about the trajectories of people in home care. And various things about how did those trajectories come to be. And there was also the interest in whether the people declined, maintained, or improved. So as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about, it was not called longitudinal deliberately, but that became, that language entered as the study unfolded and progressed, and it was probably raised, but there's a number of provinces involved, and so as we had various analysis sessions at various time points and so on and so forth, but they made me think about the work a lot as I listened.
Do anyone else have any experience with this kind of?
It is interesting, and I was thinking about a study that you said, like, someone looked at one time period in the field and then stepped back a bit and did some analysis. But not every study that does that would be longitudinal.
Yeah.
It does actually that temporal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and you are absolutely right. Like the longitudinal studies are good when we want to understand how something changed or how something is implemented or something is maintained. But it's not the only way to do research. It's one way to do it when it's a good fit for our research question. Because it's also quite time consuming.
And I don't know whether you're going to speak to this or not, but I am very interested in your thoughts around sort of the rigor and whether or not. So I think to myself, if you used standardized time points, then although everybody's experience is different, generally you can maybe think about collectively and compare different people's trajectories at those time points. Alternatively, if you use more sort of main things like admission, discharge, which can be very different in time across different people, maybe first follow-up or something like that. So those might be very meaningful and help to understand. I know you've alluded to that about the sort of the experience of the specific element that you're interested in. But yet, so for you think if somebody was discharged after 3 days versus somebody who spent 5 or 6 months, there's so many other elements. So how can you really combine that to really understand the collective experience? So I'm just curious if you have thought or you're going to share with us a little bit what you consider around rigor, or what are there elements in the design that based on what you're going to do that you really need to include to ensure that it's the most rigorous approach.
Yeah, and I'm going into something that's at least related to that soon. And one of the things I think that is very important when starting a QLR study is to really think through what phenomena that we are catching, what are we aiming at, and what is the time frame for that, and what is the expected or possible different changes that we know already or clinically have knowledge around. So we kind of design it around collecting data at the most advantage points. And if there is a large variation between participants, how should we go around that? Do we want this, or do we want one study that are looking at long discharge processes, or do we want to look at discharge processes and get the variation within it?
Also, one thing I wondered when I was looking at your data set and all the things you found about the data set, how many, or did you look at this? Because all the time people say we did a qualitative study, but I'm always wondering, well, so what? What design? What was the design of the qualitative study? And so did you find largely they just said we did a qualitative study, or did they?
Yeah, we did look at that, and because there is so much variation in how that this is reported, we looked at if they named a type of tradition, and we went with the Presswell's taxonomy for methodologies or for qualitative traditions. So we kind of looked like if they are naming a phenomenological or a grounded theory or an ethnographic or a narrative or a case approach or mixed methods, because that was some too. I think about a third said that they used any of these, and some actually said that they used several. But so a large portion did not identify with one of the traditions. I can take up the exact numbers when looking at them. But yes, we did it, and also we tried to see if there were some patterning with this, like for instance, when looking at the more theoretical sampling idea, with kind of, yeah, that kind of sounds a little like grounded theory, or this done by grounded theory studies, but we didn't get that feeling, like it was done as much in grounded theory studies as in the other kind of studies, which was kind of surprising.
Just before you can proceed, is there anyone online who has a question? Maybe just raise your hand and we'll just keep a look. Okay. Well, there'll be time for more questions, so go ahead, thanks.
Yeah, so in the next part of this project, we are looking to the findings, and we are looking at in what way can we present QLR findings and have that focus on time and change that is said in the QLR literature should be there. And when we look at ordinary qualitative studies, it's often looked like, okay, we have a group of experiences, and then it's presented in a few these categories. But it's kind of happening when you're kind of adding time in, it's not really clear, like how should we add time in with these themes? So kind of making the analysis like take it to another level. And as I said, now there are a few resources and suggestions for doing these kind of analysis, but they're quite recent, like in 2016, one of the first that are actually dealing with this came. So what we wanted to do in this second piece, we developed a kind of typology in how different articles are presenting time and change in the results. So we had those 299 studies, and we were kind of looking at how is time presented in this study? How is change described in the results? Do they talk about after, before? Do they use the quotes from the same participants together but at different time points, or are the names of the theme describing some changing process? Is change describing is there a time frame in this? So these were the kind of things we were looking at. And we kind of ended up with three different time types that are kind of structuring the results a little like they use different kind of structural principles for the results. And underneath them, there are certain subtypes that you can kind of see when we read different articles that they tend to be so the articles that we are here calling A2 is similar in the way they are like using time and change in their presentation. And first I will go and talk about different types, the structural principles. And we talk it as if we are traveling, because traveling is something that happens over time. So this is a map, and if we plot the driving from Stockholm to Göteborg, then we have two main roads we can go by. The first type A, in those studies, they didn't really focus so much on time. They focused more on what happened over time. So if we would tell anyone about traveling from Stockholm to Göteborg, we wouldn't really tell about how we drove or how the road looked like. We would more tell about what did we see along the road, what happened along the road. Yes, we went to the zoo, we saw some medieval ruins, we went to the Gränna confect factory, the kind of things that are along the road. So it's a good way to capture different kind of examples, different various narrations of what happens over a time period. But time and change is almost invisible in the results. So we're looking at type B, they are more structuring their results around what happened at different time points. So if we would talk about and describe our journey, we would kind of describe what happened first when we were when we were leaving Stockholm. What happened when we got into around Mälardalen? What did we see there? What happened there? How was the driving? How was the weather while we drove? And then when we come to Vättern and Vänern, what were the tourist attractions? We stayed for lunch. So it's more focused on the time and the chronological time of how things happen. And the third type C, it's more looking at the changes and the variation of what changes. So there's the focus on change, and we would maybe look at, okay, what's different from this kind of journey to that kind of journey? Why did we drive this way? What are the outcomes? Why was this a good journey? What constitutes a good journey from a bad? So it's more looking at what the kind of seeing the journey as a whole and making things like variation in that. So just to exemplify this a little more, we will use an example study. And I'm brave enough to go into an area I don't know anything about. But breastfeeding is a good example because it's something that happens over a short period of time relatively and have a lot of variation between different kind of women. And at least a lot of people have some experience of it. So we think that we have a population with first-time mothers who have the intention to breastfeed. And we interview them at the first time point about 2 weeks before due dates to know more about their expectations and values around breastfeeding. We interview them again 3 weeks after birth, 3 months after birth, and 6 months after birth. And now we're going to look at how this result of these interviews can be presented. So if we start with the type A studies, they were the ones that actually didn't really use time and change much. And the subtype A1, they are mostly collecting longitudinal data, but they are doing that because they want a thick description, they want a lot of context, they want good stories. So if we are collecting data at 4 time points, we will kind of present it as a thematic analysis with themes that are kind of describing these situations. We have theme 1, expectations for breastfeeding, theme 2, barriers for breastfeeding, theme 3, support for breastfeeding, and theme 4, strategies for breastfeeding. Yeah, what are the things? But interviewing these women over 4 time points will give more information about expectations or barriers or support than if they had just been interviewed once. Subtype A2, they have a little of a longitudinal design. So here we kind of take the whole data material and divide it a little into themes and then arrange one theme that's looking upon the changes. So we have theme 1, values and expectations related to breastfeeding. Theme 2, barriers and motivators for breastfeeding. And then theme 3, changes in breastfeeding over time. So we kind of put the time aspect aside and often present it in one theme or category in the end of the results. But most of the result is actually focused around the phenomenon of interest. How is the experience of breastfeeding? To go further to the type B findings, those are the ones that are structured according chronological time. We also have 2 subtypes. One type of study, they take the different time points and present them one at a time. So they kind of analysis what happened at time point 1, what were the expectations before birth, what happened at time point 2, how was it to start breastfeeding, what happened at time point 3, how was it going at 3 months, and time point 4, what was the experience of maybe ending with breastfeeding. The next one, the other subtype, B2, it's kind of similar that it looks something that happens over time, but they try to put a sequence of events. So the first one was more like very structured according to the time points, but here the researcher is kind of allocating the text to the part of the result where they have, because if you interview a person all the time, they will talk about things at the same things at several time points. We will talk about expectations at the first time point, but also at the next interview, this woman will talk about expectations and how it was starting with breastfeeding. And at the third time point, we still talk about, okay, how was it with starting and how was it now? And so here the kind of the researcher organized this to a more of a sequence of how things happened. So the first theme would be more preparations, the second initial struggles, the third developing routine, and the fourth breastfeeding in other environments, and theme 5 weaning up and introducing other foods. So it's kind of telling a story. But the participants can have been talking about this at different times points, so it will be more arranged according to the story. There would also be women that have maybe stopped breastfeeding already at 3 months or even at 3 weeks. So it kind of tells a story, but the story is kind of a common story for the whole group and might not so much illustrate the original cases in this kind of approach. When they go into the really complex designs, they come into type C, where more looking upon changes and really focusing on what happened, what are the changes over time. Then the first subtype C1, there the changes are on the theme level. So then the whole data materials is divided in themes, and each theme is changing in their own way. So then it's described like what the changing expectations and attitudes. Start with describing what were the expectations and attitudes in the beginning, how did they change to in the 3 and 6 months and over time. And with theme 2, finding and maintaining support. How was the supports in the beginning? How was the supports in the middle? How was the supports in the end? So each of these themes are changing over time. And they can change in the way that they can increase, or they can decrease, or they can, change in qualitative attributions. The second C2 is more what you described, more of looking at the trajectories, looking how different participants change in different ways. There are some of these mothers that are becoming more confident over time. They start with really struggling and they become more confident and more into their role as mothers, and this with breastfeeding is continuously getting better. Some of them are experience fluctuating feelings all over these periods around breastfeeding and motherhood and other things. And some of them will facing maybe starts well off, but then face difficulties further down the road. So there we have kind of the different characters to really see the individual differences within this group and see that different participants change in various ways. And the last part is more looking at the process and actually trying to capture how is this process of becoming satisfied with breastfeeding? What are the phases these women go through in order to be satisfied with the breastfeeding practices they do? What are the hinders? What are the barriers? How is it in the beginning? And maybe they can go back and forth between different, like struggling in one, overcoming struggling, go back to struggling. But what are the features of describing this? And this is kind of getting a little more into a grounded theory kind of way by showing a process over time. And it's also kind of a little leads time, because in subtype C3, some of the women might do these changes very fast and very quickly, and some would never really reach phase 4. But this is kind of a schematic picture of the whole group, and they will kind of inform different parts of this model depending on their context and their stories. So when we look at them together, we can see that the biggest differences between these different approaches is that the type A and type B are more on the descriptive mode, and the type C is more of an interpretive mode. It goes more into really understanding, and also the focus on time is more in type B, and the focus on change is coming more inside the type C. And as the kind of focus shift from time to change is needed to be more interpretive, because change isn't really articulated. Change needs to be interpreted in looking at what was said at that point in time to what is said in at this point in time. Well, what changed? Did anything change? How did it change? Because change can also be layered and multifaceted, and participants can talk on how they change, but change can also be seen in how the researchers see that data material differs. So some of my conclusions from working with this is that I find QLR a useful method for health research. I see a lot of relevant questions where QLR can be used, even though it's not the only option. We have a lot of very good quality methods and we should use them all, but for their particular questions. What we should consider and think about is that there are a lot of options in doing QLR. It's not a cookbook method. They can say do A, B, C, D, E, F, and then you have a ready project. But you need to be cautious on what kind of decisions you make, because that will have consequences further on. And think through, so the aim and the longitudinal perspective and the longitudinal components and the analysis and presentation actually goes together. So it's a logical flow from the aim to how data is collected to how the result is analyzed. So, I say, what are your questions and reflections now?
I thought this, what a tremendous amount of work, 299. And how clearly you laid it out, so that it really makes logical sense, the different types. And I was thinking about, how each of the types reflects different levels of descriptive and next slide, so, yeah, I think it'll be really useful. And I like your point there, about how the different methods will have conceptualizing time, or not, will.
And I also believe like, it's not that you need to say, well, you know, we should definitely do this. Sometimes you need also to kind of be reflective to data and see how it turns out somewhere. And sometimes you could use maybe two analysis, because these are often very fantastic data materials. They are large, they are rich, they are telling us different kind of stories depending on how we look at them. So with a very good and rich data material, we could maybe do both subtype C1 and C3, for instance.
One thing I've often wanted to do, but haven't managed to get there yet, is when I see a study and they have like 12 themes, my immediate thought is there's been no interpretation. And that's just a general statement. And I would like to actually look at that, at the data, and this data set is quite amazing. So I'm thinking, you know, across those almost 300 papers, I would be curious to see because what I would be looking for would be, is it interpretive work or not? And if it is there, when we make any statements about, if you see in excess of 3 things, the work's not done. But, and that's unfair, because if the intent was only to describe something, then mission accomplished.
And I totally agree with you, because sometimes the intent is to describe, and sometimes it's really important to describe something that haven't been described before, something of clinical value, something that is really useful. And sometimes, but it's also like there are fewer of the studies that, like, there are more studies in A, especially A1, than in C. And when we go to the type C studies, we see that they have more method description, they use more method references, and they often also use more of qualitative traditional method, like they are referring and being inspired by grounded theory, or they are drawing on phenomenological. So they have thought more about this than just what we want to write up this into something descriptive. So yes, there is a difference, but sometimes A1 is what we need to.
Is there anyone online who has a question for OSA?
Yeah, there's nobody in the chat, there's people online, but no one's raised them.
We just have 1 minute left, so if there's any other burning questions here, otherwise I will really take this opportunity just again to thank you so much. It's just, I would echo, just such a tremendous amount of work. And I'm thinking, even as I review articles, review grants, even, you know, I love the concept of saying, you know, this is our primary objective, and we will use this form of methodology, and secondary questions will be derived using this And I agree with you that while we should never pin people into exact, I do think that based on whether or not your primary interest is the overall experience versus change over time or specific time points, then your methodology should really, in an a priori way, be done, should be described, that that's actually how you're going to deal with the data. And I really see that this work provides another heightened level of rigor to qualitative work and longitudinal work. And again, thank you for all you're doing, and we look forward to hearing some more. And I think there might be someone online.
Yeah, that's a question.
Yeah.
Is there a question?
Yeah.
Maybe read it out loud.
Yeah, so in terms of focusing on change, how can researchers use time period to ensure that an experience or behavior will significantly change? And that's the first question, and then it comes second. But yes, that depends a lot upon what kind of question and what kind of phenomena you are looking at. Of course, that would be reading up on previous literature, maybe having initial interviews with healthcare providers in my field or patients or people living with under these situations to kind of find out and get some more of an idea what would be expected. But also in some cases, it's good to oversample too, because it can be, in one way, that can be dropouts. In other ways, that can be that you do get some participants that won't change. And that is a result too, like following people over some time and not finding change, it also a kind of result.
Yeah.
The second question is that in QLR, do we need to consider about missing follow-up? Yeah, I would say that it depends also upon what kind of subtypes you're aiming for. And I would be more concerned for missing follow-up in some of them, especially like if you are looking at trajectories or cases, then it's more important to actually be able to follow the participants. But if you are doing more the analysis on a group of interviews, that isn't as important. Maybe it would be more important in particular cases, like if you see this is a very special case, then I would really, really want to follow that person than if there are several people that are very similar and I get to follow some of them. I also think that you always need to oversample some in this kind. I find I haven't had that much of dropout. A lot of people, when recruited in QLR, they are very happy to continue and they often appreciate the interviews or that. But of course, that differ a lot about area or what kind of questions and what opportunities and what population are the population. Like, there are some studies that are like looking at people in palliative care, and of course, you can have a lot.
Yeah, so I just see our time. I think we could talk for a long time with you, and I hope people take the opportunity. I saw that you are here for the remainder for another week.
No, I'm sorry, I'm just here to Friday.
Just till Friday.
Yeah.
And are you with Tanya? Yes.
Yeah, I'm with Tanya.
Okay. So people have burning questions. Otherwise, again, thank you so much. Good luck with your work, and we'll look forward to reading more of it as you publish.
Yeah, thank you so much.